Hello, and welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents a conversation with Rosanne Limoncelli. Rosanne has taught writing and filmmaking for more than 3 decades. She is the Senior Director for Film Technologies at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. She has written, directed, and produced documentaries, educational films, and even short films such as Two Teresas and Liberty, both of which are available on YouTube. Her short stories and poetry have appeared in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Suspense Magazine, and Noir Nation. And her debut mystery, The Four Queens of Crime, will be released on March 11th. Rosanne, thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Hey, Bill, thanks for having me.
Okay, I have to get something out of the way because there might be a little bit of confusion because we just had another book called The Queens of Crime published in February, but this is The Four Queens of Crime. Um, even though,
Yes,
and
there just happened to be, I know it's like, I guess we both had similar ideas and they came around the same time. I think it must have been floating around in the air. But, and I didn't hear about Marie's book until after mine was already coming out. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I hope people enjoy both of them.
absolutely, and it's such a great idea. It's you wonder why it hasn't been done before, and now, of course, through sheer coincidence. But I have noted from my research into Agatha Christie, she is becoming a fictional character. Like for the last 10, 12 years or so, her trip on the Orient Express, her 11-day disappearance, her failing marriage. Um, she has also appeared in other books and even in a Doctor Who episode, if you have remember ever seeing that, and actually done very well, I must admit.
Well,
Um,
she had quite an interesting life. So it makes sense that people would be interested in her life and want to, continue those stories.
Oh, absolutely. She has a lot of what I would call entry points into her life, whether it's a failed marriage, rebuilding, a second chance at love, the excitement of just being able to go travel the world and go on archaeological digs. And there's even a children's book series about her with her Belgian playmate Hercule Poirot that was absolutely charming. But let's talk about the four queens of crime. Um, what inspired you to create this super group of detectives?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Obviously I'm a mystery fan since I was a kid. I've read all of Agatha Christie's stuff, and I was reading her autobiography and all the different biographies. And I started, I hadn't really read much about the other writers, but I started hearing about them, and you kind of almost run out of Agatha Christie information. So I wanted more and more. So I was reading about Dorothy L. Sayers and Naigo Marsh and Margery Allingham, and especially Margery Allingham. I hadn't really heard about her. Her books are amazing. And Naigo Marsh, I love also. They're all different in their own way. They have, their detectives are a little bit different. Their look on life, their, where they come from. And so I started reading all of them. And I read, current books too, but I read a lot. So I was reading these four authors, and I thought, what a great time period and how interesting it is as a parallel to our own, just before World War II. And so I was thinking about, what if they met just before that? What would have happened? And then I thought, were there any women? I'm really into, women protagonists. So I thought, could there be, a woman in the Scotland Yard, detective troupe that, could have had something to do, maybe met them. And I looked it up, and there was one, the very first Detective Chief Inspector, Lillian Wiles. She was a real person. And brilliant for me, she actually wrote a memoir, which I had to send for and find from another library, but it was amazing. And I thought, reading all these biographies and autobiographies from these four writers and from this detective, they just fit together. I just started picturing them, you know, uh, doing something together. And, I love, the country manor house genre and the locked room genre. And it just started coming to me how they would get together, what would happen if they were brought into them, why would they be brought together? And it just started coming in my mind. I started writing it down and doing more and more research, and it was really fun.
Well, in the pre-war era is fascinating because, of course, at that time, nobody knew what was going to happen. And there was among the intellectuals, there were, especially after the financial crash, the Depression, there is this belief that capitalism has failed and they're looking for alternative systems, and they're looking at what's going on in the Soviet Union, they're looking at what's going on in Germany, they're looking at what's going on in Italy, and you have people seeing that as the future, and you decided to incorporate that into the novel. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that I love about writing historical fiction is to make parallels with our current times because, you know, how they always say, if we don't really understand our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think that it's important to always reflect on our history. So looking back at what happened, I saw so many parallels and exactly what you said. People didn't know what was going to happen. People like, oh, Hitler will never go this far, or he'll never try to take over all of Europe, or he'll never try to even, you know, take over Great Britain. And of course, looking back on it, we know all those things, but people were thinking, you know, the upper aristocracy was thinking about how to keep their wealth, and you know, working people were trying to figure out how to, you know, have better working conditions. So there you have, you know, fascism and communism and the fight between those two things, and how people, without really understanding what those two things meant, how they fell into different categories and sort of fought each other. So, you know, what does that sound like? Does that sound a little familiar? It sounds like what we're living through today, and a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
so my characters, you know, outside of the investigative troop, they're all trying to figure all that out.
Yeah. And because you've said it in 1938, now what would like for you to address how Britain is preparing for war, because that actually has something to do with your premise in the novel itself. There's people who saw the war coming and they wanted Britain to be prepared for it. And how does that play out in the book?
Right. So I think that something we don't hear about as much is how much women had to do with supporting that help. And Lady Stella started the Women's Voluntary Service, which she was asked to start really through the Home Secretary. He said, what could we do to help prepare for the war? And she said, well, we're going to need a home front that really supports the war. So she wanted to gather the women together to help with, you know, we don't think about these things because our country really hasn't been in a war situation here in the States, but they had to think about uh, safeguarding people, taking maybe, you know, shipping the children into the country, which they did. They had to think about distributing gas masks and extra food, and, you know, how to turn farms into places that could feed the country when they couldn't rely on Europe across the channel. So these are all things that the women were very involved in. So Lady Stella started the Women's Voluntary Service in order to support the country. And that's the premise of the book. She's running this big fundraiser to raise money for the Women's Voluntary Service. And that's how she gets the four queens of crime together. She asks them to be the hosts of this big gala party, this big fundraiser, so that more people would come because she knows they're, you know, they're big kind of rock stars of their era. And they all say yes, they'll do it. And that's what brings them all to this country manor estate for the weekend to host this gala. And then that's what happens the next morning. They wake up, and the no spoiler really, because it's right in the blurb, but that's when Sir Henry, the owner of the manor house, is found dead.
Yes. And I'm looking at the book now, Lady Stella Redding. Um,
Mhm.
she's a real person.
She's also a real person, yeah, and
Yeah.
she really did run the women's voluntary service and fundraise for it and start all kinds of support for the war.
Yeah, so you have a mix of real people who are playing roles in the story, including the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare,
Mhm.
Hoare. So he's real as well. Did that present any challenges to putting the novel together to be able to portray them and have it work within the plot?
Actually, it was inspiring because as I was working out the plot and the themes and the under themes and the all the different details, I was doing a ton of research. And really, as a writer, you probably know this, Bill, you just get so deep into your research that you almost forget to write. You're like reading everything and looking everything up and watching old movies and documentaries. And then you're like, okay, wait, I just did like a month of research. I got to actually write some pages. But that's what some of us love about writing, is all the research we get to do. So, when I read about Sir Samuel Hoare, how he was Home Secretary at the time, it was interesting because he actually was, later, after he was no longer Home Secretary, he was accused of um, being a Nazi sympathizer.
I didn't
Um,
know that.
yes. So, his role in the weekend, everyone's role is suspect, right? Why? There's Sir Henry and his each child, each grown child who's a character, and his fiance. Everyone has some kind of reason why, they might kill him, or try and skew the facts to make it work for them or against the detectives. And everything I researched, I just got more and more evidence to help me write the story I wanted to write.
Yeah. So the book itself, because it takes place at Hursley House, Sir Henry Heathcote's mansion, and the party, then there's a successful party. There's certain incidents that happen as well, which are observed by our four queens. And then the next morning, Sir Henry is found dead in his library. And I got the impression from reading the book, in a way, it has certain parallels, but not direct relationships to a Christie, like, oh God, her Manor House mysteries, like Poirot's Christmas, or especially Ordeal by Innocence, because it's one of those cases where everybody has something to hide, and there's a chance of something going terribly wrong. I can't, I'm trying to say this without spoilers.
Yeah. Well, that's the other fun thing. As much as I love to research, the other part of the research was reading every single one of her books. And I'm like a charts person. So I'm making all kinds of charts and spreadsheets about when they wrote their books and what had they written so far, what did they live through so far by 1938, and what did they write afterwards. So that was the really fun thing. I wanted to, The Body in the Library is a classic genre. They've all written a Body in the Library book, some before 1938 and some after. Agatha Christie's Body in the Library was written after. So I tried to do two things. I tried to use what they had done in their lives beforehand as part of their character development, obviously, but also think about, okay, if this was a real event, how might it have had an impact on them and what they wrote about afterwards? For example, Dorothy Sayers stopped writing mysteries at that point and moved on to religious and spiritual plays and radio plays, and
Translating Dante.
translating Dante. And so I thought, well, maybe she had such a negative impact by being involved in real murder that she stopped writing mysteries because she felt it was too serious a thing, and she had made it a fun thing, so her religion kind of took over. So something like that. And then same with a little similar with the others. Niall Marsh has a little bit of romance in my book, and in the books that she's writing, her detective is on the verge of a romance, and after 1938 she writes that he does fall in love and have a full romance with Agatha Troy, who's his sort of partner wife later in her later books. So I wanted to use this story, this weekend, this imagined weekend, as a time where, okay, so maybe Niall Marsh was convinced that love was a thing that she should add to her books because of something that happened this weekend. And I made it that, so she has a romance. And she's the only unmarried of the four queens at the time in 1938.
Oh,
And then for Margery Allingham, and I can't say how much I love her books, all of them, but I know a lot of people haven't read Margery Allingham, and they should, because her books are just so good. And so same for her, what was different about her writing after 1938? So I played around with that. I mean, that's what made it fun for me as a writer, to think about them as people and about them as writers, and what was happening in their lives before and after this summer of 1938. So that gave me ideas for different details and clues and ideas.
Well, I especially like the way you brought that up, especially Sayer's reaction, because it kind of mirrors Lord Peter's reactions in the book, where he starts out as kind of this flippant dilettante, and he realizes he has to take it seriously. And at the same time, there are consequences. You even have somebody mention in the book about, you're the way you're going here, you're basically participating in the killer's execution. How do you feel about that? And I like the way that parallel works out, because then you have Sayers feeling the same thing Lord Peter did and
Mhm.
experiencing it herself.
Right, because isn't that what we do as writers? We put our real lives and experiences into our writing, you know? So I really wanted to use that. And another fun thing that all those writers did, they always referred to mysteries and literature in their mystery books. You know, they would always say, well, if this was a mystery, if this was a book, this would never happen, and they kind of, joke about the fact that they're writing a book, but it's, supposed to be real. So, I wanted them to talk about writing during the mystery also. And what would I do? What would I do if this was, here we are solving a real murder, but what would I do if I was writing it? Who would actually be the killer if I was writing this mystery? So I like that kind of fun play they have amongst each other, talking as writers.
It was especially funny when at certain points they would turn to each other and say, when all this is over, what part are you going to use? Maybe we should talk about dividing this up. And that does happen, because I know, for at least from Christie's point of view, there are certainly surprising parallels, like at Bertram's Hotel, where the race car driving socialite there's an actual parallel between a woman who actually did that. She was high up in the aristocracy, and she was smuggling watches from Switzerland to Britain, and
Yes.
she drove race cars, and Christie didn't make that up. And the parallels are absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Now,
she used real life incidences and was definitely inspired by things around her.
as you were writing each of these writers, each of the queens, what were you thinking about each one when you're writing, say, Agatha? What was predominant in your head as far as how much you know about her from your research?
That's a really interesting question, Bill. I think that, writing a book is like sort of painting a picture, right? There's layers that you go through. So I certainly, I plot out the main details, like what's the crime, and I work backwards, and what could the different clues be, and how do the different characters, um, how are they suspected, or how does that work? And then, as far as the personalities of each character, um, as I'm writing it, I have to sort of get in the mind of that character. And that goes in and out. So I couldn't write straight in a row. I sort of wrote a draft of how everything happens in general, but then each chapter I'd say, because so this is Agatha's voice, and I would actually read her autobiography and read her stories. I always do this. I can't read non research books when I'm writing a book. I have to only read things that really help me write the book. I have to only watch TV shows or movies that help me get in the mood of the book. Otherwise, I get distracted. So as I'm writing Agatha, I'm reading more of her books, and I've got a ton of her books, and I just open one up and read some more, or open her autobiography, or or her some of the biographies written about her to help me sort of get into her head. And same with the others. So as I do, then I'd go back and do another draft through, and I'd be focusing more on Naigo Marsh, and I'd read more of her stuff, and read more of her uh, autobiography and her writings to really get into her head. And eventually, as I did that, and when you write a novel, you make many drafts, you go over and over it, keep working on it until you think it gets better. And I, eventually, I felt their personalities come more naturally to me as I was editing. So I had to do that less, and now I'm actually writing another one with these characters, and they're just so much more alive for me that it's easier to switch back and forth. But in the beginning, I really did have to sort of have my prompts. Read a little Agatha Christie, write a little Agatha Christie, read a little Niall Marsh, write a little Naigo Marsh, and that worked for me.
Was it difficult? I don't know that much personal information about Naigo Marsh and Margery Allingham. Was it difficult finding more information about them to find out who they were as people?
Well, luckily, they both wrote autobiographies, memoirs, really. Margery Allingham's is a really interesting memoir that she wrote during the war, in the beginning of the war. And it's really about her town preparing and dealing with being at war. So it's really with a perfect book for me. There's still other biographies written about her. There's there was no film or video of any of them. There's a tiny bit of Agatha, right? But not of the others. And so that's, one way or the other. So in one way, I used everything I could, but then I also had the freedom to expand on that within my own imagination. So it did give me some freedom. There was less historical information. I'll tell you one thing, the information about Agatha Christie, because she's so well loved and sold, there is a lot of information out there about her. There's so much written about her, and it's amazing that I think it has a lot to do with her estate and
Yeah.
how they keep her alive. They have I mean, every single book has a Wikipedia page with all the information. Um, they've, remade TV shows and movies over and over again. So there's so much for her, and that was great. With the other authors, you're right, not as much, but it did give me the freedom to use my imagination a little bit more. But I do hope that the people that do know those authors, all of them, can find the little Easter eggs I left them in my book, because I used as much, I used a lot of real information and interesting facts as much as I could for those fans that can see it.
Yeah. I want to get into a little bit. I'm not really sure of how this would be posed in a question, actually, as far as the rest of how the book plays out, because it is a function. You have the murder of the body in the it was at the office, not necessarily library office.
So, yeah, so the library, yeah.
I'm being pedantic here. But the rest of the book is how it all plays out, because you have the interviewers, you have Chief Inspector Lillian Wiles, and you have her partner, whose name I'm blanking out on.
Rich Richard Davidson.
Thank you. And so there's a little bit of conflict there. He's the senior official, but they're working in collaboration, and sometimes they fall into some differences over whether or not to enlist the help of the writers. And then there's the family. So there's um, can you do outline of what the family
Sure.
it consists of, if you would, please?
Sure. Well, so Sir Henry is a former MP, member of the aristocracy, very rich. He's the oldest son, so he's got the title of baronet. His brother Ambrose lives at the house and helps him with his businesses, but is a very different kind of personality. Sir Henry is engaged to Lady Sarah, who is, one of the suspects as well. And then he has his son, who is about to run for Parliament, um, Charles Heathcote, and he has his girlfriend, his fiancée, Marie Sinclair, who is from the Caribbean. And then he has two daughters. The older daughter is married to expat from Spain who left after Franco came into power. And the younger daughter is still in boarding school, and she brings her best friend, girlfriend with her, who's from Italy. So it's a wide range. And I do want to say something else. I think that modern mystery or thriller readers are used to a smaller cast of characters. And sometimes a lot of characters can be confusing, but in the golden age, they used a lot of characters on purpose to give a lot of suspects and to throw your interest this way or that, so you couldn't figure out who was the killer. And a lot of the writers I write about and myself, we put a character list at the beginning of the book so you can keep track of everybody. And it's perfectly fine to keep going back to that character list to say, like, wait, who was that guy? And you look it up and it's right there for you. So that's part of the reading experience, really. So Yeah, so those are the main characters that and then there's the staff. Don't forget about the house staff. There's the butler and the housekeeper and the housemaid and the footman. And they have a lot to do with, it's a little bit upstairs, downstairs, Downton Abbey kind of thing where they see a lot, they know what's going on, and they have a lot to do with how the mystery plays out as well, because they have the inside track and they have the run of the house.
I have to
So
also uh, I want
yes.
to just confess as well, because I always have problem. I love character lists, and you had done, but you also did a very good job differentiating among the characters. It was really very easy for me to follow along and understand the relationships. And if it wasn't, I just needed to consult the list to see who the secondary characters were. So I I very much appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that because I worked really hard to do that. I did want them to all sound different and, for you to understand the differences between them because I felt every character was important to me. Everyone in the family, they had their own story. Each character has their own story and I tried to make sure that that was, came to light.
Yeah, I've been, talking to authors, and I've read mysteries for years. I actually reviewed mysteries in the 90s and early 2000s for the newspapers I worked for.
Mm.
So in some ways you almost get too caught up in writing and the quality of the plotting and the quality, and you forget that you're a reader first and you become a critic. You're very, very, very hyper. Have you found that, like when you've taught filmmaking, are you, when you're watching movies, are you critical of movies sometimes too
Yeah,
much?
that's sometimes I think, studying filmmaking has ruined movies for me, but it does make me appreciate really good movies though. But I am always, well, if I wrote it, if I directed it, I would do this different. If only they had done this, it would be just a little bit better. But that's the way it is. It's less so with books, I think, but definitely with movies and TV shows.
Yeah. And so what I find interesting is that you have your author journey in which you were educated in at NYU, and you have a PhD in teaching, reading, writing, and media. And what set you on the path for being a teacher of film and
Mm.
writing?
Well, that's a good question. I think that maybe a little bit of a teacher was always in me. I remember being in school and having bad teachers and same kind of thing, like, why aren't they, doing it this way, or why aren't they doing it that way? And mostly that was about being encouraging. I unfortunately had a lot of bad teachers that were more critical than encouraging, or may I even say mean. And that was a disappointing part of my journey as a writer. I started writing when I was very, very young, but I stopped writing for a while because I had teachers that told me I couldn't write or I shouldn't write or my writing wasn't good. And that turned me toward photography and filmmaking because I lost confidence in my written words. And I did that for a while, and I think that's why I became a teacher, because I wanted to be the kind of teacher that was encouraging to artists instead of discouraging. So I became a teacher, and when I was getting my PhD in teaching, reading, writing, and media, I had so many amazing teachers, and they really inspired me to love teaching even more. So that was an amazing part of my journey, and they also helped me rediscover my confidence in writing. Certainly, when you write a master's thesis and a dissertation, you have to have enough confidence to write that much and to publish. So then I came back to my fiction after that, and I wrote a lot. This is really um, not my first novel. I've written several novels, but this is the first one I'm getting published.
Mhm.
So writers out there, keep going, keep practicing, keep trying, and don't quit, because if you don't quit, you'll get it done.
Yeah, there's a phrase I've acquired recently: persistence trumps talent. And I've known writers, some of whom they have published numerous books, which I find deeply subpar, and yet they're still writing, they're still publishing. So good for them. That's
Yeah,
the important thing. And
right.
that,
It's a lot of work. Writing is work, and you
yeah,
have to be willing to put in the work.
yeah. And since you've worked on short films. You've written and produced and created short films, and you've written novels. What are the differences you found, the either the benefits or the obstacles that you found moving from one genre to the other?
I love doing both because, and I write feature length screenplays too. I just haven't made any of those films, but
Yeah.
I love doing both because it gives you a different kind of perspective on story structure. And in fact, when I'm writing a novel, I'll often sort of put it in screenplay format and look at the structure that way while I'm in early drafts in order to really work on the structure and the story arc as it's coming through. So I think studying filmmaking and film writing has definitely helped my fiction writing, and fiction writing has also helped my filmmaking because it gives me a different point of view on how to look at things. So I like doing both. I think they support each other.
Yeah. Is there, you find a difference between working on a film, which is inherently collaborative, and working on a novel in which basically you do everything, or a play in which Agatha
Yes.
mentioned she liked writing plays just because she didn't have to describe everything. She could
Right.
say, that's the stage designer's job, not mine.
Yeah, it's true. It's a great question, Bill, because I love filmmaking, but every time I make a film, I'm like, so many people, there's so many people, and it's so much coordination. And then I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that for a while. And then I sit down and write a book by myself. And I love it. I love just being 100% in control, doing it all myself, and people, leave me alone, let me just write. And then oh, I miss being with people, and then I want to make a short film again. So I definitely go back and forth, but you're right, they're very different processes. And I think one is a good break from the other. So once I finish a short film, I'm ready to do a novel. Once I finish a novel, I'm ready to do another short film. Although I have to say, I was directing another short film while I finished the editing of this book, and that was there was a crossover that I didn't plan on that kind of made me a little nuts and exhausted me, but it all worked out.
Yeah, I can imagine I can only keep one project in my head at a time, much less. And I've seen, there's a lovely scene in Mirror Cracked in some of the adaptations where the director is literally walking around the set trying to talk to this detective, and at the same time everybody wants a decision from him. And
Yes,
you just, no wonder no wonder people go berserk on sets sometimes. It's the
yes,
pressure is just too much. It sounds like
true.
you have an enormous well of creativity if you're writing plays and full-length movies. The novels, when were they mysteries as well, or were they literary fiction?
Mysteries.
They were mysteries.
One is actually a historical. Not one is not a mystery. It's a historical story about takes place before, during, and after the Shirtwaist Fire in New York. But the
Oh,
other ones are all mysteries, a little more on the noir side, and they take place in the 80s, not which is a different kind of period piece than the 30s. Yes, I know, Bill.
I
When
know.
people
I
say to
feel
me
so
that
old.
period piece in the 80s, I'm like, is it a period piece? They're like, yes. I'm like,
Yes.
okay.
Yes, there was a time when your phone was on your desk and not on
Yes.
you.
Well,
There,
and the trilogy I wrote that takes place in the end of the 70s and the early 80s, they are based on my personal experience in my life. So I don't feel like, for me they're not a period piece. For me they're my 20s, so hopefully those will come to light someday.
I've I've got ideas for something like that. And one of them is, I was a copy boy, an actual copy boy in the mid 70s at the Charlotte Observer newspaper. And
Wow.
I was literally there in the transition from hot type to computers. And that is such a lost era now. It's almost a liminal space between two technologies, one that has been serviceable for 100 years, and a new one, the computers, that is just coming in. And it's like one of those things I would really love to write about, just because
Yeah, that's
it's not
fascinating. I
there.
think people would like to read about that because you're right, there's a historical gap in time that I think a lot of people really don't understand how things were before and what that changeover was like. It's kind of like the difference. I've lived through the difference from celluloid into digital filmmaking, and that was a huge, especially in the teaching space, that was a huge transition for us.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because you're teaching film editing on 35 millimeter. My brother made movies, so I actually played with his
Uh,
cutting. He had a little cutting bay.
a splicer, yeah,
Yeah, with the monitor and the reels, and you can cut up the film and paste it all back together. So that was really
right,
different for you then.
yep.
Uh, you were teaching students how to use the editing bays as well.
Yeah, we use 16 millimeter, and the students made projects on 16 millimeter. They had to, when I was a student, we spliced it, by hand
Hmm.
and taped it. And we taught that for a while, and then we switched over to digital. Honestly, it's digital filmmaking is so much more accessible and facile. You could do, make a bunch of different changes and try different drafts and different ideas much quicker. It's really a better way of filmmaking, I think.
It is, but
Film was fun, but there was a lot of problems, a lot of technical problems, and it was very slow. So,
do you find it a problem, or is it more likely that because you have the ease of film that your students sometimes go overboard to take a lot of takes, or they can't make a decision because they're not limited by having a certain amount of film?
right, we definitely dealt with that during the transition. I think it's a little bit less so now. And what we teach is, really planning out your shots and making each one, beautiful and each one effective and powerful and engaging. And when you really plan them out and you really make the decisions on your frame, then you're not taking so much extra footage. But you do have the benefit of taking extra takes for the performance, so you don't have to worry about only having so much film or having to lose money by a bunch of takes that didn't come out well. You could really work with your performers and um, get a better film through the performance because you can give them more time.
Yes, I could see that. It's giving the actors time to actually perform. I've actually seen I watched movie videos on video instructions on YouTube.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, so or I waste way too much time. But at the same time, it teaches me about having a long scene, and if you plan the camera move out, then the actors get a chance to actually act with each other, rather than, okay, you do the over the shoulder shot on person A, and then, okay, now we do the response on person B, whereas the actors really would like to do a walk and talk and actually act.
Right.
um
Yeah, I mean, I always do rehearsals with my actors before we film, which a lot of people don't do because they can't get people together, they can't afford it, they have to pay for people's time. But um, a lot of times people need to do a lot of takes because that's actually both rehearsal and filming, which, can happen. But definitely actors need time to work together and like you were saying.
mhm. Do you treat your fictional characters like actors to see?
No, my fictional characters kind of treat me like a secretary
You're no longer
because they're
not
they're
treating
in
them like
charge.
cattle,
Right?
like
No,
the.
no Alfred Hitchcock. No, no. I think once I get into the mindset and I put them in a scene and I think about what that scene needs to be about, they just start talking to each other and the lines just come out and I just write them down.
Yeah.
So then I have to go back and edit them for sure, because sometimes they just talk too much. But it just starts rolling once and I think that's due to, you do enough research and enough background and you just like fill your head with all the material and all the food that your actors need, and it all just happens in your brain and you just write it down.
Yeah. Yeah. So I understand you're writing a sequel to this. That Lillian and the Queens come back together again for another case.
Yes, it's got a little extra spy thriller to it because it's not in a country manor house, it's in London. And different things happen that bring them together and uh, ask them to bring their information together to solve something that Lillian is working on. It pretty much starts with Lillian Wiles, DCI Lillian Wiles, and the others bring information to her randomly and it all comes together and is actually part of all the same mystery.
Yeah. And it can play into Agatha as well, because she got into trouble with uh, MI5 or MI6 over using Bleckley Park in NRM, I think it was. And they had to figure out how to approach her to ask, why are you using the name of our super secret spy busting facility? And it turned
She
out,
actually, well, both her, both Agatha and actually I'm sorry, Margery Allingham wrote a book during the war called Traitor's Purse, which is amazing.
oh,
That had uh, information in it that was really happening, and she was like guessing. She was like, what if this happened in the government? And it was really happening. So it's interesting, isn't it, that really most of them had such a depth of knowledge for what's around them, but also an imagination to make them create things that were actually really going on during the war. So yeah, that's a fascinating part of the history, and will definitely be part of. I'm hoping to do a trilogy of these characters, Bill. So we'll see.
oh, that's good. That's good, because it's fascinating, and I can understand, sort of like with the children's book about Agatha Christie I mentioned earlier. You That ended after 4 books because it
Mm,
really needed to. She was
yeah.
kind of a nice arc, and it kind of set her on the road. You didn't really want to have more of a story, so there would be only limited amounts of time for them to get together. But they did do. I know Agatha and Dorothy were together at the Detectionist Club quite frequently, and they
Yes,
collaborated on books for the club too, as fundraisers.
they did. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I also like to ask for a book recommendation from you, something that you'd like to pass along that you've read, and it doesn't have to be mystery, because I'm very eclectic in my reading as well. So if there's a book that you've read recently, you said, wow, I wish I could tell somebody about that, what would it be?
Well, could I say two writers?
Sure. Many as you want.
I've read everything Mick Herron has written recently. He did The Slow Horses, which is an amazing series on Apple TV. His books are fantastic, and some of them follow the TV series that's been out, and some of them are sort of excuse me, side books. But his stuff is just great. Mick Herron, uh, really fantastic. And then I just recently started reading Louise Penny, which I knew she was out there, and I kept saying, "Oh, I got to read her stuff," and I just hadn't had time because I've been reading the Four Queens of Crime for the last several years, and they have, this is hundreds of books we're talking about. But I finally did get, and I love her stuff. It's detective, takes place in Montreal, so I can't wait to read all of her stuff.
I have one of her books on my to be read list as well, and it's just haven't gotten to it because there's always something else in the way at the moment. Um, how can readers learn more about you and your books? Where can they find you online?
Well, they could Google my name, and everything's on my own website, rosannelimoncelli.com, and it leads you to Crooked Lane Books, which
Mhm.
is where my book is published. Um, uh, but there's some other things on my website you could learn about me, but I do hope people like this book. I hope people look for it. It comes out March 11th, and I'm having some in-person uh, author events over, the spring and summer. Hopefully, I'd love to meet anybody that comes out that's interested in the book.
Absolutely. And we are talking about The Four Queens of Crime by Rosanne Limoncelli. And I want to thank you, Rosanne, for talking with us today. I love this kind of conversation, the nuts and bolts and the details, and especially about two of my favorite authors. Although I've read Nio and I've read Margery a bit, but I have my favorites as well. But thank you very much for coming on here today.
Thanks, Bill. This was a great conversation.
All right. And this is Bill Peschel for Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents. And I hope that your favorite book is the one you're reading right now. Thank you. Bye bye. Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. To learn more about the store, visit the website at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.